So I wanted, before we get started, to let everyone know that I have a new podcast out, and it's called Meditations. If you like the Meditations segment of this current podcast, you'll like the Meditations podcast. It's nothing but 20 minutes of meditative sounds. And now, on with the podcast.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
We met on a Bumble. You can actually see the person's height. So at the time, I saw my girl was 4'11", and she still is. She didn't have a growth spurt, but I'm actually 5'9", so I get to feel tall. Like, I look down. What's up, girl? Like, that's crazy. I feel like an NBA player at a meet and greet. It's unbelievable. And look, I've dated a tall girl in the past, and I don't like how it feels. Because she'll put on heels. We'll go to a party. I look like her fucking son.
Good morning. It's Wednesday, Apollo Wednesday, July the 2nd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have motivation, meditation, and Apollo. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, Apollo.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
And that was Apollo. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, walking on the moon.
There are some terrible parts about walking on the moon. First of all, they spent multiple days in here with other people, going to the bathroom, sleeping, no privacy, no. Everyone who walked on the moon got sick because when they got back inside their spacecraft and took their helmet off, their spacesuits had moon dust on them. Moon dust is so abrasive that it ate away layers of the astronauts' boots and destroyed the vacuum seals of the sample containers, so imagine how painful that would be to breathe in. Also, astronauts saw flashes of light from radiation as cosmic rays traveled through their eyes. This landing looks awful. Imagine hitting the ocean at 19 miles per hour. And then when they got back to Earth, did they get to celebrate? Of course not. They had to quarantine in case they caught some moon disease. But the worst part has to be that these astronauts trained for years and literally went to the moon, and people don't believe them.
And that was the worst part about walking on the moon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Apollo 17 launch from the moon.
9, proceeded. 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. Ag thought. Pitch over. 9, proceeded. 3.
And that was the Apollo 17 launch from the moon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Saturn V launch from of the Apollo space program.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
And that was the Saturn V launch from the Apollo program. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the fateful moments of the Apollo 1 astronauts.
And these were the fateful final moments of the Apollo 1 astronauts. After the crew member mentioned the fire, within 13 seconds, the fire breached the module, tragically ending the lives of 3 astronauts. Apollo 1 was intended to be the first mission in which humans would land on the moon. On January 27, 1967, just 1 month before the launch, 3 astronauts sat inside the command module to undergo a plugs-out test. To simulate conditions like in outer space, the cabin was filled with pure oxygen and pressurized to approximately 1.1 atmospheric pressure. And suddenly a fire started because of electrical electrical sparks in the faulty insulated cabin cables. The oxygen-rich environment and flammable materials in the module created a highly combustible environment. The fire increased the heat and pressure to approximately 2 bar, which is double the atmospheric pressure, making it impossible for the astronauts to open the hatch, which was designed to open inward.
And that was what really happened to Apollo 1. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Buzz Aldrin.
And other people felt that you could turn around and come back at many times during the mission.
Right.
And you might have to do that like Apollo 13 before you got a chance to get to the moon. So we figured that chance, just unofficially, the three of us on Apollo 1, that it was about 60% that we would be able to successfully land.
Right.
But 95% that if we weren't able to land, that we would be able to come back.
And that was Buzz Aldrin. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Apollo 11 mission.
The Saturn V rocket was the most powerful rocket ever built, and it was essential to the success of the Apollo program. It was a massive 3-stage vehicle that generated over 7.6 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The Saturn V was designed to carry the Apollo spacecraft, including the command module, service module, and lunar module, to the moon. Its development was a major engineering achievement, and its successful performance was critical to the Apollo 11 mission. The Saturn V remains a symbol of human ingenuity and the power of technological innovation. The Apollo 11 mission inspired a generation to dream big and explore the unknown. Today, there is renewed interest in lunar exploration, with plans to return humans to the moon in the coming years. NASA's Artemis program aims to establish a sustainable presence on the moon, paving the way for future missions to Mars and beyond. These new missions will build upon the legacy of Apollo 11, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and exploration. The future of lunar exploration is bright, and the spirit of Apollo continues to guide us. The Apollo 11 moon landing had a profound impact on science education, inspiring countless students to pursue careers in STEM fields.
And that was Apollo 11. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Maria, then Stewart.
That tells me that companies can go ahead and increase prices in response to higher tariffs, but I don't think that consumers are going to respond positively. They'll pull back on spending, so any increase by inflation because of tariffs will be quite limited. Ultimately, tariffs may do more to increase federal revenues, reduce the federal deficit, than to add to price inflation. And of course, all this adds up to lower than expected interest rates by the end of this year.
Yeah, great point. Markets have turned negative now 30 minutes before the open on the heels of that weaker than expected June ADP report. That's why President Trump keeps talking about growth, Ashley. John, you just mentioned, people will have to raise prices. Not in Mamdani's New York, Ashley. No. Not if the government is running the grocery stores.
I loved hearing the police chief today. He was, he's going to make this city can continue to make it safe, but I mean, it's going to be a disaster if he gets elected. All
right, we will leave it there. Great to talk with you both, guys. Thank you, Ashley Davis and John Lonsky. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you again tomorrow. Markets are lower, but just fractionally. Varney and Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everyone. Okay, it took a tie-breaking vote from the vice president, but the big, beautiful bill made it through the Senate. It's now going to the House for a final vote. The GOP expects a yes vote, so the bill could be on the president's desk by July the 4th. Looks like another Trump win. There will be tax cuts, There will be help to produce more of all kinds of energy, and there will be $150 billion for border security. The Democrats, not happy. They will make cuts to Medicaid an issue in the midterms next year. Senator Schumer says people will die, and voters will remember this next year. The president has nothing on his public schedule today. He'll be on the phone calling reluctant House Republicans. Investors have been expecting the bill to pass. They like it, but stocks will open lower this morning. Dow off maybe 16 points, that's it. Small gain for the loss for the S&P. Nasdaq down 75 points. Interest rates, little change. The 10-year Treasury coming in at 4.3%. The 2-year coming in at 379. It's under 380. Bitcoin, 107 and change, 107.3. Oil, $65 a barrel. No, got up to 66. On the show today, we are 1 week from the tariff deadline. The president says he's very close to a trade deal with India, but he says there will be no extension of the tariff pause. We're going to be checking what one of our analysts calls a Goldilocks stock market. Most of the investment guys who cover stocks for us see a big rally coming in the second half of the year. They've had hints that a rate cut could come this month. The big, beautiful bill, almost done, inflation down, gas cheap, profits look good, and Trump's on a roll. And a new poll shows congressional Republicans gaining popularity. One sour note, and I hate to dwell on it, but there's an outfit called the People's Union, USA, trying to organize a boycott of traditional July 4th celebrations. No parades, no fireworks. They don't like Trump. They don't like ICE. They don't like America. They're encouraging us to remain silent on Independence Day. What's wrong with these people? It is Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025.
And that was Stuart Varney, Nonprofit News Now. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of motivation. And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, what does the phrase, if you're explaining you're losing, mean in debates? This was said by Ronald Reagan, speaking of political campaigns. From the perspective of your audience, if you have to explain yourself, you come off looking desperate to convince. As a consequence, you lose the high ground. From a more philosophical perspective, when you have a clear conscience and strong conviction towards the positions you take, your values, truth, and direction, you don't need the opinions or consent of others. As a consequence, you don't need to explain yourself. However, if you yourself are not convinced of the validity and truth of your position, or you can't fully justify your choices, then you continue to expel words in an attempt to create the illusion of certainty. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from a book that's called Good Inside. What's the opposite of understanding? For this argument's sake, it's convincing. Convincing is the attempt to prove a singular reality, to prove that only one thing is true. Convincing is an attempt to be right, and as a result make the other person wrong. It rests on the assumption that there's only one correct viewpoint. And then my question is this supposed to be convincing? Further, convincing has one goal in mind, being right, and here's the unfortunate consequence of being right. The other person feels unseen and unheard, at which point most people become infuriated and combative, because it feels as if the other person does not accept your realness or worth. Feeling unseen and unheard makes connection impossible. Understanding two things are true and convincing one thing is true are diametrically opposed ways of approaching other people, so a powerful first step in any interaction is to notice which mode you're in. When you're in one thing is true mode, you're judgmental of and reactive to someone else's experience because it feels like an assault on your own truth. As a result, you will seek to prove your own point of view, which in turn makes the other person defensive because they need to uphold the realness of their experience. In one thing is true mode, exchanges escalate quickly. Each person thinks they're arguing about the content of the conversation when in fact they're trying to defend that they are a real, worthy person with a real, truthful experience. And again, is this convincing? Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 17, Part 3 of Apollo.
3. At 10:45 on the night of November 8th, 1967, not yet 10 months after the 204 fire, the first Saturn V stood on Pad 39A awaiting a launch time of 7 the next morning. As every night, the tower and the vehicle were bathed in lights, set off by searchlights that intersected at the apex of the stack. To a New York Times reporter, the Saturn looked like a crystalline obelisk. To visiting Soviet poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the Saturn and the red umbilical tower with its swing arms were a white maiden clasped by a monstrous lobster. Rocco Petrone was reminded of a cathedral. Petrone watched through binoculars from across the marshy lake that separated the Launch Control Center from Pad 39A. The wind was blowing hard out of the north. Even from where Petrone was standing, he could see the wind meter spinning at the top of the tower and bits of debris swirling around. The winds were exceeding 32 knots, too high to launch, but Petrone's weather chief assured him that they would be within limits by launch time. Petrone ordered the propellants team to begin loading. He remained at the Launch Control Center throughout the night, watching the tower. An hour before dawn, the wind began to fade. When they had launched the first Redstones in the early 1950s, Albert Zeiler had crouched beside the slit window in the little blockhouse by the pad and watched as the engine fired up in pre-stage, with too little thrust to move the vehicle. He was deciding from the color of the flame whether the mix of fuel and oxidizer looked right. If the color was wrong, Zeiler told Debus, who stood beside him, the whole blockhouse was only a dozen feet square, and they shut down the engine and tried to figure out what the problem was. For the first launch of a Saturn V, 450 engineers and controllers were assembled in the firing room at the KSC Launch Control Center, working at 8 rows of consoles in a room 150 feet long and 90 feet wide. There was no human within 3.5 miles of the vehicle itself, nor had there been since Korn's team had begun to load the propellants 8 hours earlier. George Miller waited in the large glassed-in viewing area set off at an angle toward the back of the firing room. 4 years and 1 week had passed since he had sent his teletype to Marshall instructing them to fly the first Saturn V all up. With Miller sat others from headquarters, Siemens and Phillips among them. Not Webb, however, who always considered it his job to remain in Washington to cope with the political heat if something went wrong. In the large Marshall contingent, sitting near Werner von Braun, was Arthur Rudolph. Rudolph had been with von Braun for almost 35 years.
The two of them had shared bachelor's quarters in the early 1930s and talked about going to Mars before they could even get their first liquid-fueled rocket, 4.5 feet long, off the test stand. Today was Rudolph's 60th birthday. Like everyone else at Marshall, Rudolph had thought that the all-up decision was madness. It was Rudolph to whom Miller had said, "So what?" But whether all-up was madness or not, Rudolph was the man who had to implement it, for he was the program manager for the Saturn, and therefore he was to Marshall and the Saturn what Shea and now Lowe were to Houston and the spacecraft. To get to this moment, Rudolph had surmounted years of engineering crises, the combustion instability on the F-1, the immature technology of the hydrogen-fueled J-1 engines in the upper two stages, endless difficulties in the construction of the S-2 stage. Ever since Miller's decision, Rudolph's worries had been augmented by the knowledge that, when this day came, he would be flying two stages that had never flown even once, and a third stage that had never flown in this configuration. He hoped that he had been wrong and Miller right. Petrone was watching the countdown from his command post on Management Row. After the trials of the CDDT, this countdown was proving to be startlingly smooth. In fact, as they approached T-minus 3 minutes 7 seconds, they were right on schedule. Some of the press buses didn't leave the motels in Cocoa Beach until 6 that morning, but no one on board seemed worried about being late. Even if they got held up in traffic, not unlikely, considering the number of people trying to get onto Merritt Island to see the launch, it was inconceivable that AS-501 would launch on time, if it launched at all that day. During the last few months, everything involving the Saturn V had been late. As 7 approached, the buses were still inching their way up Route 3. At T-minus 3 minutes 7 seconds, control of the launch process was turned over to the computers. For almost 3 more minutes, Petrone would be able to stop the launch manually if he had to, but now the Saturn V was busy preparing itself to fly, receiving through the umbilical hoses still connecting it with the ground the helium that created the pressures within the propellant tanks necessary to feed the propellants into the pumps. At T-minus 30 seconds, the 55,000 horsepower turbine that drove the S-1C's 5 engines powered up. At T-minus 8.9 seconds, an electrical signal was sent to the igniters, and 4 small silent flames lit within the combustion chamber of each of the F-1s. From that moment, through liftoff, there was nothing Petrone or anyone else in the firing room could do. If something went wrong, the sensors would know it before the news could reach the firing room, and the Saturn V would shut down its engines without waiting for sluggish human beings to instruct them. So now the men in Management Row simultaneously swiveled around in their chairs. They got stuck if they didn't do it at the same time, and put binoculars to their eyes. Through the bank of windows at the back of the Launch Control Center, they watched Pad 39A. Petrone kept his hand near the button that would close protective louvers over the windows if the Saturn V blew up, though he always suspected that if it happened, he would just keep watching instead. As soon as the sensors within the combustion chambers of the F-1s determined that the igniters were lit, the main LOX valves opened, releasing liquid oxygen into each combustion chamber, where it combined with a fuel-rich combustion gas, an exhaust product from the turbine. The gas was comparatively cool, only 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and would help cool the nozzle during flight. Now it prepared the interior of the chamber for the thermal shock to come. This process took 3 seconds. The combustion of the exhaust gas produced a thick orange smoke. At T-minus 5.3 seconds, as sensors within each combustion chamber determined that the pressure at the face of the injector had reached 20 pounds per square inch, the main fuel valves opened, and a torrent of kerosene burst through the painstakingly sized and angled orifices of the injection plate, past and through the copper baffles that had been redesigned so often. The streams of kerosene, a ton per second per engine, and liquid oxygen, 2 tons per second per engine, then impinged, formed their fans, and mingling, ignited. The viewing area for the press and VIPs was across the road from the Launch Control Center. Bleachers were set up with a corrugated iron roof to ward off sun and rain. At the top of a slight rise behind the bleachers, looking like so many unpretentious beach cottages built for a view of the sea, stood the little wooden studios with picture windows in front that the television networks had built for their launch coverage. At T-minus 8.9 seconds, the people in the bleachers could see an eruption of orange smoke pushing down and bouncing off the flame deflector under the launcher and bursting out at either side. Then, a few seconds later, the flame directly under the engines turned to an incandescent white as the orange smoke billowed outward and upward, beginning to envelop the rocket. Still, 501 didn't move. Astronaut Mike Collins, who was hoping to ride a Saturn V someday, wondered momentarily whether this one was just going to sit there and be consumed in the Holocaust. The noise of the preparatory burn that had created the orange cloud was inaudible across the 4 miles separating the viewers from the launch site. Even as the engines went to main stage and they saw the incandescent white flame, the sound had yet to reach them. For the people sitting in the viewing stand, the first seconds of the pyrotechnic display on pad 39A remained eerily silent. The main fuel valves in the S-1C's 5 engines opened at slightly staggered intervals so that neither launcher nor vehicle would have to withstand the pressure of all 5 engines coming to full power at the same instant. Now, as the fuel injection pressure on each engine passed 1060 psi, a pressure switch sent a signal to the instrument unit, IU, high in the S-4B stage of the stack, announcing that the thrust for that engine had reached 1.5 million pounds. At exactly 7, the IU, having tallied 5 good signals, sent a command from the vehicle through the electrical cable still connecting it to the Earth, asking to be released. At the base of the Saturn V, 4 hold-down arms restrained the rocket as the engines came up to main stage power. The arms were massive, not so much to restrain the Saturn V from lifting off. The loaded weight of the Saturn V, over 6 million pounds, helped considerably to hold down the vehicle's 7.5 million pounds of thrust, as to lessen the rebound load on the launcher if the engines were to shut down after reaching full power. In dealing with a normal liftoff, finesse was at least as important as strength, for all of the forces restrained by the hold-down arms were transmitted back into the structure of the Saturn V. To avoid putting stress on the body of the Saturn, the arms had been placed with great precision. Glover Robinson, the perfectionist engineer in charge of that operation, had used optical equipment to sight them in, and they had been designed so that there was absolutely no doubt whether they would simultaneously and instantaneously release the Saturn V upon command. Now, receiving the signal from the IU, a helium gas pneumatic device actuated the release, which occurred in all 4 arms within 50 milliseconds. If the pneumatic actuator had failed, an explosive bolt in each hold-down arm would have triggered the release. Still, the Saturn V was not entirely free of the Earth. When a vehicle producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust is suddenly and completely let go, the release itself produces an abrupt shock load. Rather than shock-proof the vehicle to sustain this brief one-time jolt, its designers tethered the Saturn V to the hold-down arms with soft steel bolts. Each bolt was an inch in diameter and protruded into a bell-shaped socket attached to the Saturn V. As the rocket began to lift, the soft steel was extruded through the sockets, giving the Saturn V a lingering release and attenuating the shock. For the first milliseconds of its ascent, the Saturn V retained its umbilical plates. These plates, which held the fuel lines and electrical connections that would permit the launch control team to regain control over the Saturn V if the engines were to shut down, remained connected until after liftoff, a lesson learned from MR-1 7 years before. After that instant of liftoff, however, the umbilicals could come out, for there was no possibility of the Saturn V rising an inch or two and then settling uneventfully back onto the pad, as the Redstone had done. Once the Saturn V had moved even fractionally, the engines had to keep going or the Saturn would fall back, collapse, and explode. As the vehicle left the pad, it tripped 2 liftoff switches, whereas until that moment it had been imperative that the umbilicals remain tightly connected to the rocket, it was now equally imperative that they disconnect. Most of the connectors holding the umbilicals into the side of the Saturn V were of a ball release type, meaning that when a pin within the umbilical was withdrawn, the balls which had been held in place by the pin collapsed, making the connection small enough to slip out. When the liftoff switches were tripped, the rods were pulled, the balls collapsed, and the umbilicals came free. Now the swing arms, which carried the umbilicals and had given the Cape's workers access to the Saturn V on the pad, had to get out of the way. For the Saturn V, there were 9 arms on the umbilical tower, each weighing between 10 and 30 tons and designed to be swung away on a 73-degree arc for the bottom 8, a 135-degree arc in the opposite direction for the topmost arm containing the white room. The arms had given the Cape more trouble than any other item in the ground support equipment except the crawler. At the moment of launch, 4 of them were safely out of the way, already retracted. The other 5 were called in-flight arms, meaning that they remained in place until after the hold-down arms had released and the vehicle was already in motion. First, the outermost section of each arm retracted, and then the arms themselves began to swing, accelerating rapidly to get safely away from the vehicle. As the Saturn V slowly rose into the air beside them, the arms braked abruptly to avoid smashing into the umbilical tower. For Don Buchanan, watching from the Launch Control Center, the hold-down period had seemed endless, until he had finally begun to think that his hold-down arms must somehow have failed after all. Now, as the Saturn lifted and all 5 in-flight swing arms moved smoothly away from the side of the vehicle, he began to breathe again. As the Saturn V moved off the pad, the sound finally reached across the marsh and slammed into the viewing area. It came first through the ground, tremors that shook the viewing stand and rattled its corrugated iron roof. Then came the noise, 120 decibels of it in staccato bursts. People who were there would recall it not as a sound, but as a physical force. In the CBS broadcast booth, the plate glass window began to shake so violently that Walter Cronkite had to hold it in place with his hands as he tried to continue his commentary. 1 second after lifting off, only a few feet above the launch platform, 501 began to maneuver, yawing away from the umbilical tower. For the many viewers who didn't know this was supposed to happen, the Saturn seemed to be tilting as ominously as the Vanguards and Atlases of only a few years earlier. Even for more knowledgeable viewers, it was a nervous moment. If everything was going nicely, why interfere by trying to steer the behemoth so soon? And yet that was what the IU was doing, sending a pre-programmed command to the engines of the F-1, which in response were gimbaling and guiding the Saturn V away from the umbilical tower. At the beginning it seemed more a levitation than a liftoff. The Saturn rose so ponderously that it took more than 10 seconds for it to clear the top of the umbilical tower. Then, as the Saturn got farther from the ground, the scale of the F-1's inferno became more fully apparent. The rocket climbed, but the trail of flames continued to billow all the way down to the base of the launcher. Not until AS-501 was several hundred feet off the ground did its plume of flame lift from the launch platform. Grady Korn, sitting on the lower level of the firing room in the propellant row, was down too far to see the Saturn on the pad or the actual liftoff. All he knew was that the big windows in the firing room were vibrating violently and plaster dust was falling loose from the ceiling of the Launch Control Center onto his console. Now, as Korn looked back up at the window, the Saturn V came into view, rising majestically against a blue sky, and Grady Korn was cheering along with the rest of the team, jubilant that he had been so wrong. Up in the VIP viewing area, von Braun yelled, "Go, baby, go." Arthur Rudolph decided he had gotten the finest birthday present of his life. George Miller looked pleased. Now the IU's guidance system was controlling the rocket. Massive as the Saturn V seemed to an onlooker, it would not naturally go in a straight line. On the contrary, lacking a guidance system, it would have been as unpredictable as a child's skittering balloon. The job of the guidance system was to ensure that the line of thrust of the launch vehicle was aligned with the center of mass. To that end, the guidance system checked the vehicle's position, attitude, velocity, propellant levels, and a few dozen other variables every 2 seconds, and then sent messages to the 4 outboard F-1s. The center engine was fixed. If an onlooker could have gotten close enough to see, and if he could have ignored the scale of the machine, the behavior of the F-1s would have seemed almost delicate, as each of the 4 engines swiveled briefly in small, tightly controlled arcs, a few seconds here, a few seconds there, not just maintaining the Saturn V in a steady climb, but guiding it through a complex trajectory that involved program changes in attitude as well as continual, ad hoc adjustments to compensate for wind. At 135 seconds into the flight, as planned, the center engine of the S-1C shut down. 15 seconds later, the outboard engines did the same. Then, a signal from the IU exploded a cord of explosive primer attached around the base of the S-2, cutting away the S-1C. As the final act of its 2.5-minute lifetime, the S-1C fired 8 small solid-fuel retro-rockets, slowing the S-1C so that the S-2 would be safely separated when its engines ignited. The great S-1C quickly lost the rest of its upward momentum and, still carrying its exquisitely crafted pumps and piping and engines, fell back to crash into the Atlantic Ocean. High above, 8 small ullage motors on the S-2 fired for 4 seconds to give the S-2 a burst of acceleration and settle the propellants in their tanks. Then the 5 hydrogen-powered J-2 engines of the second stage came to life, developing a total of 1 million pounds of thrust. As the S-2 accelerated, a second length of primer exploded, separating the interstage, the 16-foot part of the wall of the rocket that had covered the J-2 engines and connected with the top of the first stage. The first Saturn V continued to perform perfectly. The 5 J-2 engines fired for 6 minutes, constantly gimbaling in their delicate minuet. They too shut down precisely at the planned moment. The primer cord exploded, the retro rockets pushed the S-2 back and away, and the single J-2 engine on the S-4B stage fired. And still, everything worked. The S-4B fired for 2 minutes and 25 seconds, putting itself and the CSM into a perfect orbit 118 miles high with a speed of 17,400 miles per hour. 11.5 minutes after it had lifted off the pad, AS-501 was over for the people at the Cape. It wasn't over for the flight controllers at Houston. They would relight the S-4B a few hours later, bringing the spacecraft back into the Earth's atmosphere at an entry speed of 25,000 miles per hour. But it was over at Cape Kennedy, where the 450 men crowded into the firing room had cheered again with each new report of success and were now a little groggy. AS-501, which the newspapers called Apollo 4, made the headlines the next day. But there was no way that the papers could convey what men like von Braun, Petrone, Rigel, and Korn understood. Only a few years earlier, they had been hesitantly trying, often failing, to launch rockets with a single small engine in each stage. Today, in its first trial, they had launched a rocket the size and weight of a Navy destroyer, carrying 11 new engines, new fuels, new pumps, new technology of all kinds, and had done it perfectly. There was simply no way to explain it. They could recite how heavy it was and how powerful and how many parts it contained, but that didn't capture it. We fought that thing for 17 days, Ike Rigel said, remembering the tortuous CDDT. And then on launch day, it worked. It worked beautiful. Thinking back on it, Rigel, a matter-of-fact man not given to exaggeration, could only shake his head and say, "It was fantastic, unbelievable." It was that and more. AS-501 had opened the way to the moon.
And that was Chapter 17, Part 3 of Apollo by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that greed is not conservative.